Universal basic income. It's something cheered on by certain segments of the political ecosystem, but largely derided as pie-in-the-sky idealism, something interesting but ultimately unrealistic. Or at least, that's what the people in power usually say. But the history and reality of UBI is a lot more complicated than most people think. It's time to take a deeper look at UBI, and how it could forever improve our world. So let's dive in. It's a story as old as democracy itself. Politicians making grand sweeping promises about all the good they'll do in office, and then we're lucky if they manage to get even just one piece of decent legislation passed. Not to mention how every primary is filled with countless up-and-coming politicians on the edges with their fringe ideas of how to improve society. Most of the time, these people get only a few percentage points of the vote. Sometimes they get lucky, and they nearly make it to the general election. And sometimes their populism, or at least their artificial populist image, is enough to push them into actual power, at least temporarily. This can happen on the left or the right, to different effect. But in recent years, there's a new populist campaign promise starting to gain steam: Universal Basic Income, UBI. The idea isn't a new one by any means. The first proposal for a universal basic income dates way back to 1796, when Thomas Paine of the United States found himself inspired by the Iroquois tribe of Native Americans and their relatively egalitarian society. Since engaging with their culture, and noticing the ways that British and colonial culture had developed such wealth inequality compared to the Native Americans, Paine began advocating for tax money to be distributed among the people, particularly as a way to support young adults as they began building their life, family, and career. I really wish that had caught on. That'd be very helpful to us right now. But Paine's ideas about UBI even caught the interest of Napoleon Bonaparte in France at the time. But unfortunately, as it were, the idea was largely ignored and never implemented anywhere, and it went into a sort of ideological hibernation for the next century. That is, until it was picked up by another American, Henry George, an economist living during the time of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Henry George too was inspired by the relatively egalitarian nature of Native American society, this time the Sioux tribe, but he was also unable to get the idea any real backing in government. It wasn't until 1934 that the idea would again briefly enter the political sphere, yet again in America, this time by a senator from Louisiana. But yet again, it was met with little success and never took foothold in the American government. You seeing a pattern yet? But this trend of UBI making a brief appearance in the public consciousness and then disappearing every century or so was finally broken when George Douglas Howard Cole, a political economist at Oxford, brought the idea back promptly in 1953. From there, it took off. Through the 1960s, universal basic income became a cause with staying power, finding champions in a surprisingly diverse group of thought leaders that included Martin Luther King Jr., Richard Nixon, thousands of economists, and many congressional representatives. The idea crossed party lines and ideological divides. At that time, America seemed in agreement that it was time to finally implement the old idea. Several UBI experiments were run across various states with generally positive results, and the idea began gaining broad support. Eventually, a bill was drafted, and the US government was prepared to put universal basic income into law. But of course, nothing is easy. The bill was staunchly opposed by Martin Anderson, a high-level advisor to President Nixon at the time. Martin Anderson's personal economic philosophy was governed by the extreme free market ideology of Ayn Rand, and based on the idea that the best form of society is one in which individuals have as much individual freedom as possible, even if that comes at the expense of the less fortunate. It essentially relied on the debunked idea of social Darwinism, that everyone's economic status is purely determined by the quality of their work ethic, their intelligence, and their character, completely ignoring the huge undue influence of generational wealth and the stubborn persistence of economic inequality. Martin Anderson held this belief in rewarding the rich for their wealth and punishing the poor for their poverty, a very convenient ideology considering that he himself was born into a fairly wealthy family. In an attempt to prevent Nixon from going through with the planned basic income, Anderson presented the president with documentation claiming that universal basic income had been tried for a brief period in England back in 1834 as a way to help recovery from the Napoleonic Wars, and that the experiment there had been an abysmal failure that led to greatly increased poverty and devastating economic problems. Nixon's other advisors and various economists countered this by reminding Nixon that all of the recent trials in America had been great successes, and that the experiment from 19th century England was more similar to the social welfare system America had already been struggling with, giving basic income only to the poor and thereby disincentivizing people from improving their own conditions. Meanwhile, UBI had been shown to solve this by being consistent support regardless of work, ensuring that people would never be punished for working more. But Nixon remained hesitant. He had been thoroughly spooked by Martin Anderson's pitch and changed his rhetoric as a result. Nixon still supported the UBI, and he planned to get it through Congress with bipartisan support, seeing it as his way of establishing a strong economic legacy for himself. But when he unveiled his proposals, the speeches were naturally steeped in the ideology of Martin Anderson and Ayn Rand.
There is no reason why one person should be taxed so that another can choose to live idly.
In the end, this lost him conservative support. The bill passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate. Nixon made adjustments with the help of supportive advisors, economists, and politicians, and he backed up the proposal again and again, but each time it was rejected by the Senate. The idea was then pushed to the outskirts of American politics and seen as a policy failure. Meanwhile, ultra-conservative political ideology was rising in America, eventually leading to the election of Ronald Reagan, and the economic advisor to Reagan, who other than Martin Anderson himself. Universal basic income was politically dead at that point. Having met its closest chance of success and narrowly missing, it was pushed aside, in favor of the far more draconian policies of Reagan's trickle-down economics. But yet again, UBI was only in hibernation. A powerful idea that just wouldn't go away. It came back in Switzerland in 2016 but was voted down. Meanwhile, politicians such as Andrew Yang of the United States and Jeremy Corbyn of the United Kingdom came out with their own UBI campaign promises, but both lost their elections. Yet UBI experiments are becoming more and more common now, still with positive results, and it's rapidly gaining support among technological leaders and the general public.
I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income.
The 2020 pandemic also had a huge impact on UBI. As billions of people were forced to stay home, many countries around the world finally realized that they need to provide some basic support to everyday people. As the economy fell out from under their feet, places like Canada, Spain, and other countries implemented various levels of temporary UBI to support their citizens. The challenging times of 2020 have only compacted the issue, and there are really no more excuses. Governments that do nothing to alleviate poverty can only watch their citizens struggle and suffer on the whims of the global economy. Governments that attempt trickle-down economics only build the savings of the rich as the economy around them crumbles. And governments that implement social welfare programs only create a ceiling that traps the poor in an endless cycle of avoiding work to maintain their benefits with no actual support to get out of poverty for good. The only real solution is universal basic income. When the poor get real support, they spend it back into the economy immediately, while the rich take their benefits and save it for a rainy day that never comes. There's no longer any reason to avoid UBI. I think it's been long enough now. We know that human civilization now needs to take that next step forward, to start supporting even the standard human experience as something worth valuing. Let's not waste our chance this time. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know in the comments if you learned something new, or what your thoughts are on universal basic income. And I hope to see you again next time.